Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the complete guide where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by adjustments to the suspension, differential, etc. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, though not necessarily speed. So think of this more as if I'm trying to help you keep the car from spinning or crashing instead of trying to help you get the fastest possible time. Before we get started, there's one or two things I wanted to mention. First, this is a compilation of all of the other videos I've created in the Tuning for Beginner series. If you've already watched the rest of the series, there's nothing new here, though I would jolly well appreciate you sticking around anyway. If not, there's timestamps for each section so that you can skip to whatever part of the video is relevant to you. The other thing I wanted to mention seems obvious, but it is that Gran Turismo is not real life. I did have one or two comments in previous videos saying that my findings were wrong and that you shouldn't adjust cars this way because in real life it wouldn't work. Well, Gran Turismo has always been known for its tuning menu being a bit wonky and backwards, so please rest assured that I've spent a rather sad amount of time over the last few months testing everything that's in these videos. Even if it sounds wrong, it's just the way that Gran Turismo's tuning works. Now that's done, let's get on with the guide. In today's video, I'll be covering downforce and aerodynamic parts, since it can make or break a car depending on its state of tune. To give you an oversimplification of things, the more grippy your tyres, the more necessary downforce becomes, and usually a typical road car will benefit most from having rear downforce set 100 points higher than the front for the sake of stability. However, there are exceptions on both sides which I'll touch on later, but first I will give you a guide to the aero parts themselves, since they're not all born equal. I'll start with front aero, where there are two types of parts available. Take this 1968 Dodge Charger for example. As standard, it has a chrome bumper, but the Type A option smooths the bumper for a cleaner look. It shouldn't surprise you that this does not add any downforce. These parts are quite rare and are usually reserved for classic cars, such as the chrome bumper removal on cars like the Classic Mini, Jaguar E-Type, and various muscle cars, as well as the skid plate or bull bar options for the pickup trucks and Suzuki Jimny. These parts are purely cosmetic. The other type of front aero part is the splitter. This adds up to 100 points of downforce to the front. The majority of front aero parts available in Gran Turismo 7 behave the same as this, whether it be the small chin spoilers available for most classic American cars, the generic carbon fiber splitters found on the majority of modern cars that were in the game at launch, or the hyper-aggressive splitter and canard sets available on some of the game's more recent additions. Side-mounted appendages such as skirts or winglets will not add downforce, so they are purely cosmetic. Moving to the rear of the car, some cars have multiple options that can have a fairly dramatic impact on the tuning potential. There are three types of rear aero that can be added. Once again, the first is purely cosmetic and adds no downforce. Examples of this are the smooth bumper option for the Dodge Charger, the reflector delete for the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution 4, 5 and 6, and the chrome bumper removal available on the Jaguar E-Type and various other classics. The second type of rear aero adds only rear downforce. These parts add up to 100 points of downforce to the rear, so they are effectively treated like a rear splitter. These include the rear bumper spats available on several JDM cars, such as the Mark III Toyota Supra and Honda S2000, the rear bumper lip available on other JDM cars, such as the Suzuki Cappuccino or the Nissan Silvia S13, or the weird hoop on the R31 Skyline. When coupled with a rear wing, these options allow you to run rear downforce that's up to 3 times higher than the front downforce. The third type of rear aero is what we'll refer to as diffusers. These parts are highly recommended if they are available, because they add up to 100 points of downforce at the front as well as the rear. The downside is that they're quite often not the best looking addition to your car. Diffusers usually all look very similar, like a bunch of carbon fibre flaps glued to the backside of the car, but there are some exceptions, such as the rear bumper lip available for the R31 Skyline, or the more subtle eBay diffuser on the BMW M2 Competition. Lastly, we have rear wings, of which there's three types. The first is the wingless option, for those who want their Imprezas, Evos and GTRs to look less yobbish. This makes no difference to downforce and is once again purely cosmetic. It also doesn't remove downforce, however, so the R34 Skyline, for example, will retain its downforce. The second wing option is what we'll refer to as quote-unquote type spoilers, type A, type B, etc. These include lip spoilers available on some German cars, the ducktails available on Japanese cars, generic hatchback spoilers, the DTM hoop on the E36 M3, and the more bespoke GT wings available on cars such as the Lamborghini Gallardo, Audi R8 V10, and the FL5 Civic Type R. These add up to 150 points of downforce to the rear. The final wing option is the custom wing set that allows you to choose the size and the type of winglet. No matter which option you pick, these custom wings add up to 200 points of downforce to the rear, so they have an advantage over the previous type spoilers on high-powered cars that are prone to instability. So, if your car allows it, the best options for performance are a front splitter, rear diffuser, and a custom wing. With the Aero parts installed, we need to adjust them. The downforce values you choose will ultimately depend on the car, track, or performance point limit, so I'll go through a few scenarios to help you. I'll start with a front-wheel drive on racing tyres. Most front-wheel drives can have a front splitter and a generic hatchback wing that gives you a max downforce of 100 at the front and 150 at the rear. This typically works just fine since most front-wheel drives are generally quite stable. There are exceptions though. As you can see when I weave the steering at high speed in this Megane, the car is very reactive. On tracks like the Nürburgring, it could become unsettled, which reducing front downforce will help with. Setting it to roughly 70 makes the car less twitchy. On the other hand, if you're at a short track like Tsukuba, you can take advantage of the car's low speed stability and drop the rear downforce values to encourage the car to rotate more, which can potentially gain you a tenth or two. Next up, we'll look at a high-powered rear-wheel drive car on racing tyres. The Toyota Crown can have a front splitter, rear diffuser and custom wing, so it can have a total of 200 downforce at the front and 300 at the rear. Maxing out both usually works for most applications, but once again it can cause some instability on faster corners. Reducing front downforce makes a big difference to high-speed stability, so if you find that your car is too twitchy at high speeds, you may find the downforce is the culprit. The next car I'll touch on is a classic. Many classic cars such as the Jaguar E-Type, Lamborghini Miura, Mercedes 300 SL and Aston Martin DB5 can have a big ugly rear wing but no front splitter, so you only get rear downforce. If you're using racing tyres, the rear downforce is still necessary, but while maxing it all the way to 200 can improve the car's stability and reduce the performance point rating, it can have some side effects. The first is a reduction in top speed, obviously, but the second is that the front end can lift in certain situations. Take this Lamborghini Miura for example. Going through Schwedenkreuz at the Nürburgring, the front end lifts up more with the rear downforce maxed, making it difficult to recover in time for the next corner. Finding the happy medium based on the track is the trick, but generally I recommend roughly 100 points of rear downforce, or more if the track doesn't have crests and bumps like the Nürburgring. The last car I'll touch on is the Lamborghini Gallardo, which shares its predicament with only a couple of other cars in the game. It gets a front splitter and a rear diffuser, allowing for high front-end downforce numbers, but there's no option for a custom rear wing, leaving you with the bespoke type spoiler that gives less rear downforce. This means the front downforce can be set very high, not far off the rear downforce. This isn't recommended, however, as the car will be very hard to control at high speed. Reducing the downforce at the front will make the car much more controllable. Downforce can also be used to your advantage if you're trying to set your car up for a particular performance point limit. Let's say you have a car that you're trying to limit to 700 points for the World Touring Car Le Mans race, for example. Most people would typically add weight and limit power, but maxing out the rear downforce and reducing the front downforce can reduce the performance point rating without the car taking as big a hit to its actual performance. This can also make the car more stable and prone to understeer instead of oversteer, which can help with consistency. To put this into practice, I ran a quick test with the Toyota Crown at Dragon Trail, a track that should benefit cars with high front downforce. However, the extra power allowed by reducing the front downforce more than makes up for it. Both cars have 700 performance points, and yet the variant with lower front downforce and more power is faster, easier to drive, and will also have a higher top speed. The Crown goes 2 seconds per lap faster with the front downforce reduced. So, to conclude, Downforce is one of the most important and transformative aspects of setting up your car. The more grip your tyres have, the more important it becomes to have Aero parts applied, and finding the right front-rear balance to suit you can make the biggest difference to a car you're struggling with. The more unstable your car, the more rear downforce you should run compared to the front. Suspension tuning is by far the most complicated part of setting up your car, not only because there's several parameters you can adjust, but also because it's somewhat dependent on your choice of tyres as well as the car itself, where differential, downforce, ballast, and gearing will generally remain similar no matter your choice of tyre. For this video, I will cover body height or ride height, anti-roll bars, and natural frequency, since they tend to be the three parameters that have the biggest impact on the way your car handles. It's worth mentioning that the point of this video is not to tell you how to make your car faster. My aim with this series is to tell you what subjective differences you will feel when setting up your car, and my priority is to help you make your car easier to drive, as opposed to faster. I'll start with natural frequency, which in my experience is the most important single part of your suspension tune. Natural frequency, or spring rate, is a measure of how fast the coil springs will oscillate after applying a load. To common folk like us, it's basically a measure of how stiff the car is. Using the Toyota Hiace as a visual example, I'll show how natural frequency affects the way your car drives. The main effect you'll see is body movement. A low natural frequency will result in a car that leans a lot, and can deal with bumps or high curbs well. A high natural frequency will make the car lean less, and it'll be more unsettled by bumps and curbs. The way you set your natural frequency will depend on the tyres you choose. Running the car on high-grip racing tyres with a low natural frequency will result in excessive body roll bordering on uncontrollable depending on the car. This is because the grip of the tyres is quite literally throwing the car around. Imagine tying yourself by the waist to a streetlight, and then running away from it as fast as you can. As the rope tenses around your waist, the rest of you soaks up the inertia and your body flails around like a rag doll. I don't recommend trying this. If we fit low-grip comfort tyres to the same car, you'll see that the body roll is now much more controllable. This is like tying yourself to a streetlight and walking away from it instead of running. Next, here's the car on racing tyres with a high natural frequency. Notice how it's much more controlled because it's not leaning and throwing itself around. If we now try the stiff car with low grip tyres, it still corners flat, but it won't have as much grip, and as a result will be slightly slower. So why is this? An oversimplified way of explaining it is that a low natural frequency will actually give you more grip than a high natural frequency, because as the body leans, more weight is pushed onto the outside wheels. This is ideal on low grip tyres because they need all the help they can get. It's like having downforce, but it's caused by gravity instead of wind resistance. It can help the car pull itself around corners. Increasing the natural frequency and reducing that weight transfer will result in the outside wheels having less grip, and as a result the car will feel kind of like it's driving on ice. The reason that the extra body roll is controllable on weaker tyres is that they don't have enough grip to throw the car around as much, so the transition of body roll from one side to the other is slower, smoother, and more controllable. The reason this doesn't work on slick tyres is because as the outside wheels get more grip, the inside wheels lose it. This is fine on road tyres, since the difference between maximum and minimum grip is fairly small and manageable. On racing tyres, the difference in grip levels is much larger between the outside wheel that's got weight on it versus the inside wheel that doesn't. This can result in a car that feels like it's wandering, especially if you don't have downforce. So, if you make a small adjustment at high speed in a straight line, the car can feel like it's going to keep turning. The other downside is with more grip the car will change direction faster, meaning all of that body movement happens in a shorter space of time and is more violent as a result. This is part of the reason that fully upgrading a car without making any suspension tweaks can often result in a car that feels terrible. The default settings have a low natural frequency. Coupled with a lowered ride height, this can cause more issues, which I'll cover later on in this video. So, we've established that if you have more grip, you should be more stiff. Hang on, that didn't come out right. Anyway, what happens when we change the natural frequency between the front and the rear? To test this, I'm using a Honda S2000 that's fully upgraded on racing tyres but without a turbo. Generally, it's a very friendly car with a slight tendency towards oversteer. The current footage shows the car with a high natural frequency of 3.30 at the front and the rear. So how about if we reduce the frequency at the front? Setting the front to 2.50 and leaving the rear at 3.30 will make the front end softer, resulting in more grip at the front while the rear stays flat. This results in the car feeling more agile. However, when changing direction quickly, the car can become unsettled, since the tyre with the most grip is the outside front, which is pulling the car towards the inside or apex of the corner. It's controllable on this S2000, however, as you drive cars with increased power, you may run into problems with overall stability, especially on mid or rear-engined cars. If we reverse the changes so that the front frequency is at 3.30 and the rear is 2.50, the wheel with the most grip is now the outside rear wheel. This means the rear end is less likely to break traction, meaning your car is more stable. Notice how I'm accelerating sharply out of the corners and the car is reluctant to transition to oversteer. This means that the car is easier to drive but will feel slightly more prone to understeer. However, there are ways in which this can make your car harder to control. Here is an 1100 horsepower Corvette from my Taming a Monster series going through the Schwedenkreuz sector of the Nürburgring. It has the frequency set to 3.30 at the front and 3.15 at the rear, and it takes this section fairly well with no real drama. Here is the same car with the rear frequency dropped to 2.50. And while it has slightly better traction on corner exit, watch how the dip in the road makes the car wander to the left, making it more difficult to recover for the next turn. Worse still, the soft rear means that the back end can lift during braking, resulting in very unstable braking. As a small side note, I haven't really touched on how natural frequency will affect the car's ability to take bumps. This is because it doesn't have as much of an effect on the overall driving experience as the body roll does. As you've already seen, a car with racing tyres fitted will need the increased frequency to remain controllable. The result is that the car will be unsettled by high curves slightly more than if it has a soft natural frequency, but it's a bit of a necessary trade-off. You can slightly counteract this, however, by fitting smaller wheels. So, that was a detailed explanation of natural frequency, and here's the short version. If your car has racing tyres fitted, you'll need a natural frequency of roughly 3.0 or higher to keep the body movement under control. If you have sports tyres, I would recommend somewhere around 2.20 to 2.50, and if you have comfort tyres, I'd recommend roughly 2.0 or possibly lower. You can set the front frequency lower than the rear to make the car more agile at the cost of some stability, and you can set the rear lower than the front to make the car more stable at the cost of agility. Setting the values between the front and rear dramatically different to each other can result in some unfavourable handling characteristics. Next up, I'll cover body height, also known as ride height, since it somewhat works in tandem with natural frequency. It's much less complicated than the frequency simply being a measure of how high off the ground the car is. While its effects on the car's handling are nowhere near as obvious as with natural frequency, it can still have some very adverse side effects if it's not set up correctly. So obviously, the lower your body height, the lower your car is, and the majority of us like a lowered car. However, you can go too low, and here's some examples. The first is the Corvette C4 once again with the front end as low as it can go. I've used the Nürburgring Taurus layout to quickly get us to the Tiergarten section, which has a slight downhill that transitions into an uphill braking zone. In faster cars, this results in a pretty violent compression of the suspension. What happens next is that the steering violently wrenches to one side without any input from the driver, and the car is sent into the shadow realm. To many who have experienced this, it may seem like a glitch, but there is a reason for it. Wheel arch rubbing. The tyres have hit the inside of the wheel arches on full compression, resulting in the car being bump steered off the track. This is just one way in which arch rubbing can manifest itself. Cars that suffer from this include the C6 Corvette ZR1, the Lamborghini Gallardo, and the most well-known example is the E36 M3. However, there are worse examples of wheel arch rubbing. This is a Shelby GT350R, and the front end is lowered all the way. In this car, the wheels are already tucked inside the arches, and just turning the steering will result in arch rubbing. As a result, the car only gets about a quarter of its total steering angle. This means driving it is a very saddening experience. Other cars that suffer with this kind of affliction include the De Tomaso Mangusta and the Volkswagen Beetle. The only way to prevent this is to increase ride height at the front, and increase natural frequency to prevent the front end from diving. As a result, your ride height should depend on the tyres you're using, much like the natural frequency. On racing tyres, you'll likely have a high natural frequency, allowing for a low ride height. On tyres with less grip, you'll probably have a lower natural frequency, meaning the car has more body movement, which makes arch rubbing more likely if the car has a low body height. You can use the same lowered height and increased frequency on low grip tyres, however the car will exhibit the driving on ice feeling I mentioned earlier. Now I'll give a brief overview of how ride height affects the handling using the S2000 once again, on racing soft tyres with the high natural frequency that I already recommended. A low ride height will allow the car to change direction more quickly due to a lower centre of gravity, but it will also make the car more prone to power oversteer. Running the ride height at the same level as stock makes the car feel slightly more planted, but it feels slightly less agile with changing direction. Running an abnormally high ride height will make the car feel very stable when accelerating out of corners, but it's even slower to change direction. Increasing ride height will also increase aerodynamic drag, reducing your top speed slightly. I did also experiment with setting the ride height higher at the front than the rear, and the other way around, though this didn't make a huge difference until I tried extreme differences. But generally, a nose down setup will cause more power oversteer, and a nose up setup will make the car more planted. The ride height will also affect the way the car handles curbs. A fully lowered car doesn't have enough suspension travel to deal with the bumps. A raised car with a high natural frequency will also be quite bouncy. With the height set 10 to 20mm above the minimum, it's somewhat less dramatic. So to conclude on ride height, the difference it makes is more subtle than with natural frequency, but, like with the frequency, it should be set based on the tyres you're using. A low ride height will help the car change direction more quickly, while increasing it will generally make the car less agile but easier to drive. If the ride height is too low, the car can suffer from wheel arch rubbing, and if it's too high, the car can become unstable or potentially even roll over. The last thing I will cover today is the anti-roll bar adjustment. Anti-roll bars are fairly simple. The stronger they are, the more they prevent body roll. However, unlike with natural frequency, they only affect lateral movement. So, they can prevent the car leaning from side to side in the corners, but they won't stop the car from lunging under heavy braking. To show how anti-roll bars can affect the handling, I will take the S2000 once again to the Nürburgring, specifically the first sector. With a high natural frequency and a low but not minimum ride height, and racing tyres, we'll start with the anti-roll bar set to 10, the maximum. The car handles much as you'd expect. It has a very firm ride, but it's stable enough. If we now set the anti-roll bars to the other extreme, 1, the car is terrifying. If you hit a curb, the car will pogo, which can easily cause a crash. I then experimented with several cars on different tyres with different drivetrains to find a general consensus for how anti-roll bar settings will affect the handling. In general, a high front anti-roll bar setting will encourage oversteer when braking. This becomes more obvious if the rear anti-roll bar setting is lower. Not ideal on a Porsche. However, the same settings will also make the car slightly less prone to power oversteer. A high anti-rear roll bar coupled with a lower front anti-roll bar will make the car slightly more stable under braking. However, it'll be slightly quicker to transition to oversteer when accelerating and potentially harder to rescue once it does start to slide. A low overall setting will make the car feel less composed and more prone to oversteer, even on nearly stock road cars. A high overall setting will make the car feel more predictable, though this can potentially lead to some understeer. For the majority of applications, I would recommend setting the front anti-roll bar between 5 and 10, with the rear anti-roll bar set to the same value or potentially 1 or 2 clicks higher if your car suffers with oversteer under braking. In front-wheel drives, I recommend a fairly low front anti-roll bar setting between 2 and 4. I would set the rear higher, though I couldn't find much subjective difference between setting it at 4 or 10. And I think that just about covers it. For today's video, I'll be covering damping, camber, and toe angle. These settings won't have anywhere near the same transformative or potentially ruinous effects on your car's handling as the body height and natural frequency, but they can make subtle changes that will help or hinder your car's overall setup. I will start with damping ratio. This dictates the stiffness of the dampers, also known as shock absorbers, which are there to limit the oscillation of the coil springs. This is why a car with defective shock absorbers or dampers will have a pogo effect when it goes over bumps, because the bounce of the coil spring is no longer being dissipated. The way this works in Gran Turismo is, the higher the setting for the dampers, the more they will prevent the coil springs from oscillating. If you have a high natural frequency setting on your springs, they will oscillate more, meaning any effects the dampers have will be more noticeable. Conversely, if you have a low natural frequency setting, the effect of the dampers will be less noticeable. As for the two settings themselves, they're fairly self-explanatory. Compression dictates how strong the dampers are when they are being compressed, for example when the car lands after going over a jump. Expansion dictates how strong the dampers are when the damper returns to its neutral position, so this is after the landing when the suspension is fully compressed and is now returning to its normal height. To give a visual representation of the effect of damping ratio, here is my trusty Honda S2000 at Laguna Seca, where there are some particularly perilous sausage curbs. The natural frequency is high and the dampers are set to the minimum, and as you can see, the curbs make the car lose control once it lands. If we now max out the dampers, you can see that the same corners don't unsettle the car nearly as much, so setting your damping ratio to a high value is recommended on cars with a high natural frequency. I also repeated the same test in an unmodified Dodge Viper with a fully customizable suspension on settings that mostly resemble stock. On the minimum damper settings, the car was affected by the curbs, though nowhere near as much as the race-modified Honda S2000. Maxing out the damper settings made a very slight improvement to the car's ability to ride curbs and bumps, but it was much less noticeable thanks to this car's lower natural frequency values. I then tested different combinations of settings in a few different cars to try to find out if having higher values at the front or rear made a difference, and to be quite honest with you, I could barely tell the difference. In Gran Turismo 7 there's almost no situation in which low damping settings will benefit your car, and there's almost no situation I could find where high damping settings didn't help either. So in general, damping settings make very little difference to the way your car handles. The biggest impact they make is on the car's ability to soak up bumps or high curves. Higher settings will make the car less bouncy when landing, and less likely to be thrown off the track as a result. Low settings won't dampen the oscillation of the springs, resulting in a pogo effect that can unsettle the car. This is more pronounced on cars with a high natural frequency. Next up, I will cover negative camber angle. Applying negative camber will make your wheels tilt inwards at the top. Some people say this gives the car stance. I say it gives the car Ricketts disease. Either way, the theory behind it is, when the car turns into a corner, it will lean onto the outside tyres. If the wheels have negative camber, this should increase the amount of grip the outside tyre has and increase the overall grip levels throughout the turn. But does it work like this in Gran Turismo 7? Well, not as much as you'd think. The first difference it makes is to straight line traction, though this difference is very small. Here is the S2000 braking from top speed with zero camber and maximum camber. As you can see, the braking distance is slightly lower for the car with zero camber. It can also cause extra wheel spin in cars with high torque, such as this Corvette, which is slightly faster in a drag race with zero camber. As for the difference it makes on a track, it doesn't do as much as you might expect. To test its effect on high-speed cornering, I used the Honda S2000 again at Blue Moon Bay and ran time trials with the camber set to 0, 1.5, 3, 4.5 and the maximum 6 degrees. The best lap on all settings was 45.4 seconds, except with the camber set to 1.5 degrees, which managed a 45.2. However, subjectively, the car felt no different. I then performed the same set of tests at the Suzuka East circuit to see what difference it makes to low speed cornering. This time the car managed a 49.9 with no camber and a 49.6 on all of the other camber settings. So between the two tests there's very little difference, but the car performed best overall with the camber set to 1.5. I then tried the Dodge Viper again to see if it made more difference on cars which have more body roll thanks to a lower natural frequency. This time there was a slightly more clear difference. The car was almost half a second slower without camber than it was with camber. However, the lap times remained much the same whether the car had 1.5 degrees or 6 degrees of camber. There was also very little subjective difference. I then tested several different cars to see what happens if you set the camber higher at the front than at the rear, and the other way around, and this is where I found slightly more noticeable subjective changes. If you set the front camber higher than the rear, the car will be slightly quicker to turn in, but slightly more likely to transition to oversteer when accelerating out of the corner. If you set the rear camber higher than the front, you'll have more mid-corner stability. However, the car may be slightly more prone to oversteer when braking due to having slightly less rear-end grip when travelling in a straight line. However, it's worth mentioning these differences are tiny. So to summarise, camber makes very little difference, but all of my testing found that the car was generally fastest with the camber set between 1 degree and 3 degrees. If the camber is lower at the rear, it may make the car more stable under braking. If it's higher at the rear, it can make the car more stable when accelerating out of a corner. It's very difficult to tell much difference between any of these settings though. The last item on the list is toe angle. If you look down at your feet and tilt them towards each other, you have a toe in angle. If you tilt them away from each other, you have a toe out. Now imagine the wheels on your car doing the same thing. When setting up your toe angle, a positive value will give you toe in, which means the wheels will point inwards towards each other. A negative value will give you toe out, which will point the wheels away from each other. Toe angle has a few effects on the car's performance. The first is rolling resistance. Adding toe angle to a car increases tyre wear and fuel consumption, and will reduce the top speed by a minute percentage. You'll barely notice this in Gran Turismo, but I thought it was worth mentioning. If you do drag racing or top speed runs, you'll generally want your toe angle set to 0 as long as your car is stable enough. To show the other changes, we'll go back to the Honda S2000. The majority of cars by default have 0 toe on the front and between 0.2 and 0.3 toe in on the rear. This S2000 has exactly that, while all the other settings have been tweaked in line with what we've learned so far on this series. As you can see, the car is very neutral. Toe in at the rear will make the car feel more stable when accelerating and turning. So, what if I reversed the rear toe angle and gave it a 0.30 toe out angle instead? A toe out angle at the rear will make the rear end pull itself around more when accelerating out of a corner. What this means is that the S2000 is more prone to oversteer, something we've spent the past 2 episodes ironing out of the car. So this may seem negative, but it can be used to make cars that are prone to understeer more agile, so it's useful in front or four-wheel drive cars. So how about the front toe angle? To give you a better idea of the effects of front toe angle, here is a Porsche 911 Turbo. It's a death trap that's usually tamed with ballast weight over the front axle. However, this 911 has none. I'm at the Alsace test course since it's a killer for cars like this. I'll start with 0 front toe and 0.35 rear toe in, and I'm trying to drive aggressively to upset the car. There's slight lift-off oversteer in the banked turn, slight power oversteer coming out of it into the sweeper, braking oversteer in the left-right, and some power oversteer on the way out. Now the car has 0.15 toe in at the front. It has more lift-off oversteer in the banked turn, similar power oversteer coming out of it into the long sweeper, but also more sway going in a straight line. Massive braking oversteer in the left-right, and similar power oversteer on the way out. I also tried 0.30 toe in, and the result was much the same. I then tried a 0.15 toe out on the front. It had less lift-off oversteer in the banked turn, slight power oversteer in the long sweeper, but it was slower to transition. It still had some braking oversteer on the left-right, but was slightly more controllable. And power oversteer on the way out was much the same. If we max the toe out on the front, it makes the car more stable when changing direction at high speed, and the car will try to go in a straight line when braking and turning to begin with. However, the car can exhibit some very unpredictable snap oversteer when it does start to slide, even worse than usual. The idea that front toe out helps with stability was a bit of a shock for me, since the in-game tutorial suggests that toe out will result in less stability, but then Gran Turismo's suspension tweaks have always been slightly backwards here and there. So, here's the quick summary of toe angle. If you have a car that's prone to lift-off oversteer or instability while braking, adding some front toe out will help slightly. If you have a car that understeers, some front toe in can help get the car rotated on corner entry, especially useful on front-wheel drive. If you have a high-powered rear-wheel drive car that suffers from power oversteer, adding rear toe in can slow down the transition to oversteer. If you have a car with good traction on corner exit, such as a four-wheel drive, adding some rear toe out can help launch the car out of corners and pull itself around. If you add too much toe angle, the car can potentially exhibit some unpredictable handling characteristics. So, that was part 2 of suspension tuning. Today's topic is differential tuning. For something so cheap, a well-sorted differential can make a huge difference to the way your car drives, something that applies in the real world as much as it does in Gran Turismo. I'll start by trying to explain differentials as best I can, and then I'll go over the various tuning options, followed by a simplified explanation of what each adjustment can do to the car's behaviour, and I'll end with a few examples. So, a differential, or diff, is basically what the engine's power is sent through before it reaches the drive shafts that send the power to the wheels. There's 3 types I'll cover today: the locked diff, the open diff, and the limited slip diff. While it's not modelled in Gran Turismo 7, I'll briefly explain locked or welded differentials. The closest we can get to this in the real world without modifications is in cars with selectable 4-wheel drive, such as the Suzuki Jimny or the Jeep Wrangler. These cars are rear-wheel drive during daily use, where the rear wheels have an open differential. However, when you select 4-wheel drive, the front wheels get power through a locked differential. What this means is that both wheels have to spin at the same speed. This works fine on a 4x4 being used on a low grip surface or in a drift car that's supposed to lose grip, but in daily driving, a locked diff will result in skipping when turning tight corners. This is because both wheels try to spin at the same speed, but the outside wheel needs to spin faster because it's covering more distance. If you drive a basic car in the real world, such as an entry-level Ford Fiesta, it will likely have what's called an open differential. In Gran Turismo 7, cars that have this are typically lower-tier front-wheel drives and the vast majority of classic road cars. This is represented by the differential values showing as 0 in the settings. In the real world, an open differential is a cheap way to allow the driven wheels to spin at different speeds, which is great for going around sharp corners. The issue is that the power coming through the differential will take the path of least resistance, which means that the inside wheel that has less weight over it will get more power, which will spin, causing the one-tyre fire you may have heard of. In Gran Turismo 7, cars with open differentials have a messy driving feel with 2 main traits. The first is excessive wheel spin. See how the revs climb when exiting the corner, because the inside wheel is spinning up, and when the car straightens and both wheels get equal power, the revs drop and the car grips up. The other trait is lift-off oversteer. This means the car has very exaggerated transitions between corner entry and corner exit. The other type is a limited slip differential, or LSD for short. To oversimplify things, it can send power to the wheel that has the most grip, instead of an open diff which sends it to wherever is easiest. It can also limit slip during engine braking if you have a 2-way system. Using the Volvo V40 from earlier and fitting an LSD to it, you can see that the wheel spin is almost gone and the car is much more composed, with less violent transitions between entry and exit. The powerful Chevrolet Corvette has also tidied up. While it will still spin its wheels, the transition to oversteer is much smoother and more predictable. So, now I'll go over some tuning options. The first is a one-way LSD. This only intervenes when accelerating, which means that whatever car you fit this to will have the benefits of better power delivery out of the corners, but can be prone to lift-off oversteer or oversteer under braking. The only situation I can think of where this may be beneficial is in a front-wheel drive on a tight track like Tsukuba. The next option is the 2-way differential. This is the same as the next option, except it can't be adjusted, and as such, it's more or less pointless. Next is the fully customizable limited slip differential. This is the same as the 2-way diff, but adjustable, and it's a must-have on any road car you plan on upgrading. It allows you to adjust the level of intervention to your preference. The final option is only available on about 20 cars in the game. The active LSD controller, I believe, is meant to replicate an E-diff, but in the game it feels more like an open diff. I will explain in more detail later. There is also a torque vectoring center differential available for most all-wheel drive cars. This simply allows you to tell the car how much power to send to the front or rear wheels, between 50 and 95%. I'll cover this later as well, but for now, I'll cover the fully customizable diff. If you've watched my Taming a Monster series, you may have seen me give a fairly basic explanation of differential tuning before, so here I'll try to give a more detailed explanation. First, we have initial torque. It can also be referred to as breakaway torque or preload. The Google AI definition of initial torque is the amount of torque that locks the differential even when the driven wheels aren't rotating at different speeds. Frankly, that didn't really mean much to me. In Gran Turismo, the higher the value, the faster the differential will respond to accelerator input. What that means to you and me is the higher the value, the more the diff will intervene and clean up the car's behaviour. What it does for the handling is much simpler. Lower values mean the car feels more agile but potentially less stable. For example, the car could become more prone to oversteer when braking. Higher values mean the car feels more predictable and composed but less agile. Higher values will also slightly increase the effectiveness of the next two values. Next is acceleration sensitivity. This effectively determines which wheel the power will be sent to. Lower values mean the diff is more open, sending more power to the wheel with the least grip, which is the inside wheel. Higher values mean the power will go towards the wheel with the most grip, which is the outside wheel. Generally, higher values will make the car lean towards oversteer more than lower values. The trick is finding the balance for your driving style. Last is braking sensitivity. This determines how much the differential will intervene during engine braking. Lower values will make the brakes feel sharper and help with agility and turning at the expense of stability. This is not ideal on rear-heavy cars that are prone to lift-off oversteer. Why does Porsche insist on putting the engine in the wrong bloody place? I thought we grew out of this lunacy when the pyramids were built. Higher values will make the car feel more composed under braking and on corner entry at the expense of agility and sharpness of the brakes. Let's go over some examples. I'll start with the simplest, a front-wheel drive. Because the front wheels have to do everything, these cars can be prone to understeer, so typically we want them to be as agile as we can get them, especially if we're using racing tyres. Low initial torque values and low braking values can help with this. Acceleration makes less of a difference beyond a certain point. If it's set to less than 20, the inside wheel will spin more than the outside wheel, meaning you'll effectively lose power when exiting a corner, and you'll also get more understeer. Increasing acceleration sensitivity helps the car pull itself out of corners, but on higher powered cars it makes less of a difference. There are exceptions though. Some of the faster front-driven cars can be prone to some braking instability on rougher tracks like the Nürburgring, so increasing initial torque and braking sensitivity can help. This also applies to front-wheel drives that aren't using racing tyres. Sports and comfort tyres have lower grip in general, making the car more prone to sliding. So in some cases, increasing the initial torque or braking sensitivity can help tidy up the car's handling. Next up, I will cover a more extreme example of a rear-wheel drive. Muscle cars are typically the hardest to get right, especially on slick tyres. Initial torque comes down to personal preference. Setting it low can help get the car turning, but an 800 horsepower American V8 can be hard to tame, so increasing the initial torque can help calm it down slightly. Acceleration is usually easier to handle if it's set low, between 10 and 20. Too high and the outside wheel will spin too much, making the car feel more prone to oversteer. Too low and the inside wheel will spin too much, making the car feel like shit. Braking sensitivity will also come down to personal preference. When setting up your car, I would recommend starting with a braking value of 5, and if the car is unstable when braking, adjust upwards from there, and I would also do the same with initial torque. For mid or rear engine cars, typically the initial torque will benefit from being set higher than in front engine cars to deliberately make the car feel less agile in order to stabilize it. Acceleration is much the same as other rear-wheel drives. Braking usually has to be set quite high to help with lift-off oversteer, though other things that can help with this are reducing front downforce compared to the rear, or adding ballast weight to the front. Four-wheel drives represent the most convoluted, because we have to adjust for both axles. This is further confused by the torque vectoring center differential. I'll start with initial torque using an Impreza as an example thanks to its neutral balanced handling. If we set the initial torque high at the front and rear, the car will be stable but also prone to understeer. Great for cars like the Porsche 959, which can feel like a death trap. If we set it low at the front and rear, the car will be agile, but at the expense of some stability. The car will be faster around a track with lower values, but harder to control thanks to some oversteer under braking. If we set the front low and the rear high, the front end will be agile and the rear will be stable. What that means in practice is the car will be even more prone to oversteer under braking, but when accelerating out of a corner it will be prone to understeer. This is not recommended. If we set the front high and the rear low, we find more of a balance. Increased initial torque at the front will help with braking oversteer, while low initial torque at the rear will make the car less likely to go wide on corner exit. For acceleration sensitivity, I changed to the Peugeot 205 Group B rally car. Its tendency towards oversteer should highlight the changes more, though this means that more neutral cars such as Imprezas and Lancer Evolutions may require some more aggressive settings. Maxing the front and rear will make the car more prone to four-wheel drifts when exiting corners. This can be useful, but harder to control. Setting it to the minimum makes the inside wheels spin, and the car will understeer and generally feel terrible. This is more noticeable if you have more power or less grippy tyres. Maxing the rear and leaving the front at the minimum is something I would only recommend on low-powered cars that are very prone to understeer. On the 205, it makes it feel more like a rear-wheel drive car, but countersteering can result in a violent snap of oversteer, slingshotting you into a hospital. Maxing the front and dropping the rear feels very similar to minimum settings both sides. The car is very prone to spinning the inside rear wheel, which overpowers what the front wheels are doing and leads to understeer. My recommendation would depend on the car. If your car is prone to understeer, maxing the acceleration sensitivity can help the car pull itself out of corners. If your car oversteers when accelerating, I would run between 30 to 60 at the front and between 15 and 35 at the rear. Having it slightly higher at the front will generally help with the car's stability. At the rear, finding the sweet spot between the inside wheel spinning causing understeer and the outside wheel spinning causing oversteer will be the priority. Last, we have braking sensitivity, which as it turns out makes very little difference. Here is a Porsche 959. Anyone who's tuned it will know it's a death trap, because the engine is, to put it scientifically, in the wrong place. To test the effects, I deliberately tried to provoke braking oversteer on the first corner at Suzuka. In the end, I found that braking sensitivity does very little on all-wheel drives. Here is the car with the braking sensitivity set to the minimum, and here it is set to the maximum. I tried the same with the Impreza from earlier too, and got similar results. I also tried this with the initial torque set low, and the initial torque set high to see if it was a case of the differential not intervening enough, but I still found very little difference. What I did find is that having the braking sensitivity set low made the brakes feel slightly sharper, as usual, while setting it high made them feel slightly weaker. I also tried setting the braking high at the front, low at the rear, as well as the other way around, and still found very little difference. It seems that the front initial torque and the ballast weight are the two things that will most affect braking oversteer on all-wheel drive cars. I'll now briefly cover the torque distributing center differential. It's fairly simple. You can either send more power to the rear wheels, making your car more like a rear-wheel drive, or you can send up to 50% to the front. Typically, cars with their engines in the middle or the rear, such as the 959 or the newer Lamborghinis, will have power understeer if you send too much power to the front. They'll generally feel more neutral with around 70% of the power sent to the rear, because the rear weight bias means that the rear wheels have more traction. Front-engine cars have less rear traction, so sending more power to the rear will result in power sliding, which can be tough to rescue since the small portion of power going to the front can result in snap oversteer. Sending 40 or 45% of the power to the front wheels will give you that classic four-wheel drive feeling of being glued to the road. And finally, we have the active LSD controller. It is very rare and only available for a select few cars, and here they are now. AMG Mercedes GTR, Aston Martin DB11, Aston Martin 177, Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, 2013 Dodge Viper, Ferrari F12, 2006 Ford GT, 2017 Ford GT, 2017 Honda NSX, Jaguar F-Type, Lamborghini Aventador, Lamborghini Aventador SV, McLaren F1, McLaren MP4-12C, McLaren 650S, R35 GTR, R35 GTR Nismo, Pagani Huayra. Christ. I might have missed one or two. If I did, please let me know in the comments. Almost all of them are modern supercars, with the exception of the McLaren F1, which is a classic, and the Jaguar F-Type, which is a boat. Initial torque is locked to 50, so we can't adjust it. The adjustment range for acceleration is smaller, locked between 5 and 30, and the braking sensitivity also has a small adjustment range, but much higher, set between 40 and 70. I tested it on the 2006 Ford GT with the settings at 50, 20, and 50. What I found is that the car behaves more like it has an open differential, spinning the inside wheel. While this doesn't feel particularly nice, there's no denying that it's stable. The car also feels quite unwilling to change direction when compared to what I'm used to. Since the fully customizable diff can be set to matching values, I tried it to see if the two diffs are directly comparable on the same settings. Turns out, they're not. On the active controller, the car tended towards understeer, and hard acceleration out of corners would lead to the inside wheel spinning, which was generally more stable. On the customizable LSD, the car behaved more as you would expect, kicking the tail out. I also found that adjusting the active LSD made very little difference. Increasing or decreasing acceleration made almost no difference that I could tell, as the inside wheel would still spin on throttle out of corners, whatever it was set to. Braking sensitivity didn't seem to affect much either, so I would almost treat the active LSD controller as a non-adjustable part that completely changes the behaviour of your car. It works fairly well as a one-step solution to the more unstable cars that can have it fitted. If you're having trouble with cars like the Ford GT or McLaren F1, the active LSD controller can make them easier to drive, though it can come at the expense of agility, and the inside wheel spinning can make the car feel subjectively messy compared to the smoother transition to oversteer that you get with a customizable diff. So, that was what turned out to be a much longer video than I expected on differential tuning. In today's video, I'll be covering transmission and gear ratios, something that some cars are more sensitive to than others. I'll begin by showing you the choices for upgrades, and then I'll go into ratio adjustment, followed by my usual process from start to finish, and then I'll show a few examples that should hopefully give you an idea of what to do when tweaking your own car. While there are options for fixed ratio transmission upgrades, they're almost completely pointless, except in some rare cases where the top speed is so adversely affected that the performance point rating drops. These options will also be of the same type as a stock gearbox. What that means is, if your car has a paddle shift gearbox out of the box, these transmissions will also be paddle shift. If your car has a manual transmission as standard, these will also be manual. The two options that are actually worth buying are the fully customizable transmissions. There is a manual option, which is a cool addition that allows you to manual swap cars, such as the Lexus LFA or Mercedes SLS, which only came with automatic gearboxes. The other choice is the fully customizable racing transmission. The only difference between these two gearboxes is the speed of the gear shifts. While the manual has dead time when changing gear, where your car isn't accelerating between gears, the racing transmission shifts instantly, allowing for faster acceleration. This also helps with turbo lag on cars that are affected by it. For this video, I will just be using the racing transmission. Next, we'll go into the adjustments. There's three ways in which these gearboxes can be adjusted. Top speed is the simplest and the most compromised way to tweak the ratios. It will adjust all gears to a very generic spacing that often leaves first gear too short in more powerful cars. It's worth mentioning that top speed values are measured in kilometers per hour, so if you have no idea what a kilometer is, you'll need to develop a talent for conversions. It's also worth mentioning that if you've upgraded your car with parts that increase the red line, the top speed slider will be inaccurate, and once you go into finer adjustments, you'll see the top speed is much higher than what you set. The second way to adjust the gears is the final drive. This effectively does the same thing as top speed, but it allows for much finer tweaks. Something worth remembering is that whatever value you set the final drive to will remain if you were to go back and change the top speed. So, if you set the final drive slider all the way to the left, changed your top speed, and then went back into the finer adjustments, you wouldn't be able to move the final drive any further left. The final method is individual gear adjustments, where it tells you the ratio value as well as the theoretical top speed of that gear, in kilometers per hour. These aren't always 100% accurate though. There's some quirks here which I'll try to explain. The adjustment range for each individual gear is limited by the gears surrounding it. That basically means we can't make Gear 3 shorter than Gear 2 or longer than Gear 4. If we were to shorten second gear or widen fourth gear, it opens up the range of adjustment for third gear. The exception here is first gear, where its range is limited by whatever the top speed is set to. So, if you set the top speed low, you can't extend first gear very much. If you set the top speed high, you can adjust the first gear to over 100 miles per hour, which is very useful on high-powered cars such as the Challenger Demon. Next, I will go over my process to adjust the ratios, using this Mitsubishi Evolution 9. The first thing I do is adjust the final drive slider to the center. Next, we can change the top speed. The setting you choose here will depend on what sort of top speed your car is likely to have. If you're still unsure what to set your top speed to, My recommendation is to head to the Special Stage Route X circuit, set the top speed higher than you think the car is capable of, and head onto the track. This should give you an idea of the car's actual top speed. As you can see, the Mitsubishi does roughly 190 miles per hour. Converting that into kilometers per hour gives us a value of 310. So now we have a rough idea of what the car's top speed is. We need to consult the power graph. You can find this by adjusting the racing ECU or power restrictor. As you can see, the Mitsubishi makes all of its power at the top end, so we ideally want the car to spend as much time in that rev range as possible. You can also find exact power and torque peaks by viewing the car in your garage. The Evo makes peak power at near enough redline and peak torque at 6,100 RPM. Since the power drops off dramatically below the torque peak, we ideally want the car to always stay above 6,100 RPM. I typically go for a one-size-fits-all transmission setup, which I'll show you now. Knowing the car tops out at 310, I'll set the top speed slider to 280. Now if we go into the finer adjustments, we can reduce the top gear down to roughly 330 km per hour or roughly 200 miles per hour. This gives us some room to go faster than 310 km per hour if we get slipstream. Now we need to adjust first gear. Since this is a four-wheel drive, it's capable of an excellent launch if the ratio is set right. So head onto any track, stop the car and try a launch. The Evo launches well, but there's potentially scope to make the gear longer and still launch well. I widen first gear by 10 km per hour and try launching again. Still good. I add another 10 for 110 and try another launch. This time you can see the car bogs down slightly, so we've gone too far. I tried 105, which was still too far, so for this car, a 100 km per hour first gear is the sweet spot. Now we need to adjust the rest of the gears between 1 and 6. Generally, we want fairly wide ratios for low gears, which shorten as we go to the higher gears. By the end, the graph should show a smooth transition from low gears to high gears. Next, I test it to find any imperfections. We want the car to lose as few revs as possible with each gear change, so using bumper view helps as it gives you a better rev counter. As you can see, the revs drop quite dramatically between first and second gear, but the rest stay nicely in the power band. Back in the settings, I shorten the second gear by a few Ks and try it again. And now it's better. So, we have a transmission setup that allows for good launches, small drops between gears, and a high top speed. And, since the final drive is centered, we can adjust that to increase the overall top speed if you're doing a low drag oval race, or decrease it if you're doing a short track, all while keeping your gear ratios nicely spaced. You may want to adjust your first gear back to the launch sweet spot though. So, we now have a one-size-fits-all gearbox setup, but we could make it more optimized over a lap if, for example, you're doing a rolling start. We have the luxury of not needing to limit first gear for launches, so we can extend first gear and the subsequent gears. This closes the ratios even more, so taking the car out onto Road Atlanta, for example, we can use first gear for the slowest corners, and instead of hitting the red line, we're just entering the power band, and we're only using the top of the rev range throughout the rest of the gears. You could take this to a rather comedic extreme on a track like High Speed Ring, which has almost no low speed corners. However, we can't really extend first gear any further. The way around this is to extend the top speed slider. This will undo individual ratios, so it might be worth doing this on a spare setting sheet. This will now allow you to make first gear even longer and close up the subsequent gears even more. This trick is very useful on high-powered rear-wheel drive cars, since they'll often wheel spin to over 100 miles per hour and waste the first 2 or 3 gears spinning. I wouldn't recommend this on cars like the Mitsubishi though, because if you spin or crash, it's going to take quite a while to get back up to speed. Now that I've shown you the full process, I'll go over some examples of cars that might need a different approach. I'll start with the Alfa Romeo Giulia GTA M. This shares its advantage with cars like the Lexus LC500, where it has more gears than it actually needs. Many cars in Gran Turismo 7 have 7 or more gears, and with these cars, finely tuning your ratios doesn't give you as big an advantage as cars with less gears. With cars that have 8 gears or more, you can more or less just set the top speed so that the car can reach over 400 kilometers an hour or 250-ish miles per hour, and it will stay in the power band. The next example will combine two unique issues. The Chevrolet Chevelle SS has over 900 horsepower, and as you can see from the power graph, it makes almost none of it close to the red line. So we have a huge amount of power and torque going through the rear wheels, which will lead to a mile-long burnout, and we also have a torque curve that drops off dramatically. Naturally, this car will suit changing gear manually and short shifting, but the transmission ideally needs to be altered to reflect that. Starting off by setting the top speed high, we can then adjust first gear to over 150 km per hour, or nearly 100 miles per hour. While the top speed of this car is roughly 205 miles per hour, or 340 kilometers per hour, we set the top speed of fifth gear to nearly 270 miles per hour. This is to make sure that the car is in its power band at 200 miles per hour. I will also show you a side-by-side comparison of short shifting this car versus shifting nearer the red line. There's several cars in the game that do suffer from power drop-off at high revs when fully upgraded, including the Suzuki Cappuccino, several classic muscle cars, and the two diesel Mazdas, so their ratios need to be set longer than in cars that make their power near the red line. The next example is the complete opposite. The Honda Beat has about 10% of the torque of the Chevrolet, and it's made at 9,000 RPM. It also only has 5 gears like the Chevrolet, meaning your ratios are going to be a compromise. If you want a gear setup that allows the car to reach a good top speed, over 140 miles per hour in this case, we'll have to compromise with first gear. We can either make first gear fairly short, meaning that we still get a decent launch, but the revs will drop below the 9,000 RPM peak in second gear. It will also mean that we can't use first gear in low speed corners, and in certain situations, second gear might drop below peak torque. Alternatively, we can make first gear longer, sacrificing our launch for the sake of less drop off in second gear, which also allows us to close up the rest of the gears slightly more as well. This also means first gear can now be used in low speed corners to allow for a better exit. A video like this would not be complete without the car most affected by transmission tuning, the Mitsubishi Evolution with the Suzuki Escudo engine swap. The Mitsubishi GTO also has the same swap. Both cars have to make do with only 5 gears, meaning that the ratio setup is compromised no matter what you do. With 1200 horsepower, both cars are capable of very high top speeds, particularly the GTO, but to attain high top speeds, you have to completely sacrifice acceleration, or launch. Redline is 8,400 RPM, peak torque is 7,000 RPM, and the car barely wakes up below 6,000, so you have one of the narrowest power bands in the entire game. Ideally, we want the car not to dip below 6,500 RPM when changing gear. For this video, I've created 2 gear sets, both of which top out at 225 miles per hour. The first prioritises a decent launch. With all-wheel drive, the longest we can have first gear is roughly 90 km per hour, or 55 miles per hour. The rest of the gears have been set up to get the car to 225 miles per hour without bogging down too much. But if you watch the footage, you will see some lag as the revs drop to around 6,000 RPM between gears. One way around this is sending more power to the rear wheels via the torque distributing center differential, which can allow you to extend first gear because you get more wheel spin. And the downside of that is that you also sacrifice the advantage of having all-wheel drive in the first place. The other gear set prioritises performance over the course of a lap at the expense of a launch. First gear is set to 120 km per hour or 75 miles per hour. This means the rest of the gears can be closer together. The launch will be terrible, but there'll be almost no turbo lag above 50 miles per hour. The other advantage of this gear set is on tracks with low speed corners. The setup is more usable on more tracks. So, I think I've covered everything I know. Today's topic is ballast weight. To most of us, less weight is better in every situation. For example, at the start of the 2024 Formula 1 season, many of the teams removed most of the paint from their liveries in a bid to shave off the last kilo or two to get closer to the weight limit. Another example is the 1986 Group B Rally Championship, where Lancia entered the Delta S4 and shaved weight anywhere possible, to the point that the car was downright fragile and had to be replaced with the older, more durable Lancia 037 for some of the more demanding rally events. All of this sounds like common sense. Less weight means better braking, turning, tyre wear, fuel consumption, and acceleration. However, Gran Turismo 7 doesn't always subscribe to the idea of common sense, and there are a few instances in which some strategically placed weight can actually make you faster. Ballast weight is fairly simple. Available in the tuning shop, it allows you to add up to 200 kilos or 441 pounds, while also giving you the choice of how far towards the front or the rear of the car you place that weight. This can greatly influence the weight distribution, which is one of the most important things that will define a car's handling characteristics. For example, adding ballast weight to the front of an unstable mid or rear engine car can reduce lift-off oversteer. On the flip side, adding weight to the rear of a front-heavy car can reduce understeer. All of that is fairly self-explanatory, but there are situations where ballast weight can make your car faster than without the weight, which seems counterintuitive. But in Gran Turismo 7 at least, it does work. To show how it can help, I'll now go over a few examples. The simplest example is a drag race. Granted, we don't perform many grid starts in Gran Turismo 7, but as power is increased, wheel spin can occur at well over 100 miles per hour. Adding ballast weight over the driven wheels will add grip to those wheels, improving acceleration out of corners. Here is a fully upgraded engine-swapped Honda Integra with no ballast on the left, and on the right we have the same car but with 200 kilos of ballast over the front axle. With the added weight, it's half a second faster in the drag race. Taking it to even more of an extreme, here is a 900 horsepower Chevrolet Chevelle under the same circumstances. With 200 kilos of ballast over the rear, it's over a second faster in the 400 meter sprint. The next examples will be full lap comparisons, showing circumstances where ballast weight can make a car faster. We'll stick with the Chevrolet Chevelle for now. On the left, the car has the full 926 horsepower and all weight reduction with no ballast. On the right is the exact same car with roughly 100 kilos of ballast weight as far back as possible. So the car is heavier, but its weight distribution is closer to the rear, where the power is going. While braking distances are increased and the car does not change direction as fast, the improved traction from low speeds makes the car faster overall, despite the lack of low-speed acceleration zones on this particular track. The Chevelle also feels generally nicer to drive with more weight too, since it's less prone to wheel spin and, as a result, slightly less likely to oversteer. When adding weight to the rear of a powerful front-engined rear-drive car, it's worth keeping in mind that you can overdo it. Once the weight distribution reaches 50-50 and beyond, the car can be prone to lift-off oversteer, similar to a Porsche. With these cars, a slight front bias is usually a good compromise. 52-48, for example. Speaking of Porsches, here is our next example. The 911 Carrera CS, like the rest of the 911s, has its engine in the wrong place. Thanks to all of that weight out past the rear axle, the car is notoriously difficult to drive. When the driver lifts off the throttle, the weight of the car shifts forward and the rear end lifts, and that engine swings around like a pendulum, sending the car backwards into a tree, killing the driver to death. On the left is the fully upgraded car, and on the right the car has 80 kilos of ballast added to the front. Through the midsection of the track, the car is a nightmare to drive without the ballast, where the added weight makes the car slightly more stable. It's barely faster, but it will be more consistent compared to the same car without ballast. You can once again go too far, however. If the weight distribution goes too far forwards, say 50-50 for example, the 911 will struggle for traction when accelerating out of corners, which is one of the 911's biggest advantages. The last example is rather extreme. Anyone who's been with this channel for a while will hopefully be familiar with this death trap. High power, lightweight, front-wheel drive cars simply don't work. On the left, the car is fully upgraded with no weight added, and on the right is the same car but with 180 kilos added to the front. The brakes are now next to useless, but the increase in traction out of corners more than makes up for it, since without the weight the car will wheel spin to well over 150 miles per hour. So, as you can see, ballast weight can sometimes be faster depending on the car. Typically, the cars that benefit the most are front-heavy muscle cars and the most rear-heavy sports and supercars. If you're struggling with your car, some strategically placed weight may be the answer. And that is the complete guide to Gran Turismo 7's tuning menu. If you're looking for more advice, I also have videos on how to set up particular drivetrains, and I also have a few videos on more specialised areas of vehicle tuning, such as the effects of wheel size on performance, or the performance point warning triangle issue. If you stuck around for the whole video, I really appreciate it. This channel is well on its way to 10,000 subscribers, and I'm very grateful to you kind folk who've come along for the ride. This video will conclude the Tuning for Beginners series, meaning something else will have to replace it. Thank you very much for watching, please do like, subscribe, all that lovely stuff, and I'll see you next time. Take care, and ta-ra.